محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم. Sister, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa
Sorry about
rahmatullahi wa
that, sister.
barakatuh.
I was trying to invite you and it said you had to update your app.
Done. Got the
Thank you,
message.
thank you, sister. It's always a privilege to have you. You've joined us on Haraka Hussainiya's live feeds before, so thank you again for taking time out
My honor.
to join us. First, I want to ask you, what did you think of Father Christopher's talk?
That was amazing. I had to do what you suggested that we do.
Yeah.
No, it's so inspirational hearing somebody from another faith take such an avid interest of something that probably we don't have that depth of knowledge that he does. So, alhamdulillah, it was inspirational to hear. And this is the second time we've been on a program together. I'd love to be able to talk to him directly one day. I was eagerly trying to find his books, but I wouldn't get them in time. So I was reading articles about his work, and it's amazing. Assalamu alaikum, everybody.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. I believe, yes, if I'm not mistaken, someone messaged me about this as well. So I think some of his books are, one, if not two, are sold out on Amazon. So I don't know. But obviously, Father Christopher is on Instagram. He's also on Twitter. So hopefully, if anyone wants, they can contact him directly. Sister, again, thank you for your time. I want to get sort of continue from what Father Christopher was saying, and he mentioned an important word I feel in that talk, and that is trauma.
Right.
What is trauma, Sister Barak?
Okay, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Azam Allah ajurana wa ajurakum biwafat Sayyidatina wa Mawlatina Sayyida Zainab. And before we get into Salam Allah alayha, and before we get into the full depth of what trauma is all about, it's really important to understand that we're going to be talking about things that could be very triggering, right? So I want our brothers and sisters who are watching to be aware of that if they have experienced past trauma or experiences, they could be impacted. So please do reach out to the appropriate supports and resources. Of course, there's also Nasiha in North America that you could call, or the Muslim Youth Helpline in the UK. And you can also reach out to me. I won't be able to do private counseling, but I can then direct you to actual therapists, because I don't do private practice, and I work full time. I don't have time for that when people ask me for that, but I can definitely connect you to the appropriate resources. So when we talk about trauma, it's important to understand that it's a person's emotional response to a distressing experience. So few people could go through life without really encountering that kind of trauma. And unlike ordinary hardships, these types of events tend to be sudden, unpredictable. They involve a serious threat to life, so bodily injury or death, and it's beyond a person's control. So most important, events are traumatic to the degree that they undermine a person's sense of safety, keyword there, in the world, and it creates a sense of catastrophe that could strike at any time. So for example, you've got the parental loss in childhood, automobile accidents, car accidents, physical violence, sexual assault, military combat, political unrest, natural disasters, right? Or the unexpected loss of a loved one. These are commonly traumatic events. Like we said, these feelings that can be elicited when you hear this, they can make you feel helpless, right? The sense of security has been impacted, and you feel disconnected, unable to trust others, and it won't go away easily. And so there's a few types of events, types of trauma. So I want to go through that. We're going to be doing a lot of psycho-educational, mental health, wellness, and inshallah we'll tie it in all together. So bear with me while the psychoeducator comes out here to talk about this.
Go ahead, sister, please.
Bless you. So it can be caused by one-time events, right? So accidents, injuries, attacks, especially unexpected, like we said, from childhood, violence, especially, and these are called acute trauma effects, right? So it's in the intense distress in the immediate aftermath of a one-time event. And the reaction of that duration, it could be short, right? So like we said, it could be an accident, an actual physical assault, or sudden death of a loved one. Then you have chronic trauma, which can arise from harmful events. So these can be repeated or prolonged. And as I was listening to the father earlier, as he was describing how Sayyida Zainab alayhi salam, from childhood till adulthood and beyond, was experiencing one traumatic event of watching and witnessing family members being attacked or murdered. And so we could potentially categorize what she experienced as chronic trauma, right? So and it can develop a response, like we said, to bullying, neglect, abuse, or you're seeing domestic violence, or in this case, say to Zainab, the repeated attacks on her family, right? So this ongoing continuous stress, it can, again, be defined as something that's, well, I don't want to keep saying traumatic, but yes, of course, it's traumatic, right? It can impact you.
Yeah, of course.
And so we'll get into the symptoms in a second. So even commonly overlooked causes such as surgery, especially in the first 3 years of life for children, or the sudden death of someone, a breakup of a significant relationship, or even a humiliating or deeply disappointing experience, these can also be considered, especially if it was cruel, these can also be considered traumatic. So even if you were not directly involved in an event, you can be impacted by that. So just watching, for example, a natural disaster or a man-made disaster, as we are bombarded by images on social media. Like the most recent one that we had was back in the summer when we saw what happened in Beirut. You cannot just watch that and not be impacted on any human level, right? Even though you may not have been directly impacted, meaning let's say you were not from Lebanon, you don't have any families, just watching that kind of traumatic disaster happen can have an impact on you, right? Because it can overwhelm our nervous system. What's really valuable in understanding this is that there are ways that we can work through to move on. So just quickly to give 3 more types of trauma is that there's complex trauma. And this can also arise from repeated or multiple traumatic events when there's no possibility of escape, right? With a complex type. So this is a sense of feeling trapped as part of this experience. And it can also, again, like we said, undermine safety in the world, right? You become very hypervigilant, constant monitoring. It's exhausting, like the environment around you of possible threats after you've experienced that type of trauma. Then you have the secondary or the vicarious trauma, right? Where you can be exposed to somebody else's suffering through their trauma. So for example, professionals who are in the field, and I think we can closely relate this to the medical professionals who have been experiencing the pandemic. That's a good example where they have been, where they've been watching a lot of people suffer and struggle and lose their lives, or families losing loved ones during this time, right? So they get that secondary trauma or the vicarious trauma, living through another person. Obviously, you hear the expression living vicariously through you. Well, there's a trauma with that as well, right? So what's also important here when we talk about mental health professionals, we are at the risk of compassion fatigue. That's an actual term that I actually came across in the last 2 years recently, not early on in my studies, because I actually experienced this and I didn't even realize it until my close friends, some of my family members, they've studied psychology, and my own therapist said, sounds like you're dealing with compassion fatigue. When you give so much, investing emotions in other people, you burn out yourself, right? So it's really important to set those boundaries to protect from the other people's experience of distress. So this is a really fascinating one. When you give so much of others, when you're in the professional field, that if you don't take care of yourself, you can burn out, right? And finally, we have adverse childhood experiences, which cover a wide range of difficult situations that children either directly face or witness while growing up. So before they developed their effective coping skills. So this can disrupt a normal course of development. It makes sense, right? The emotional injury can last, as we know, into adulthood. So for example, a loss of a parent, neglect, emotional, physical, sexual abuse, divorce also for young families. So what can these result in, right? We know that it affects a person's sense of safety. In a child, what they experience, and if you could think of people around you or circumstances, or even hypothetically, it will include them feeling that they're in an unstable, unsafe environment. The separation, obviously, from the parent is going to happen. It could lead to serious illnesses, intrusive medical procedures, sexual, physical, verbal abuse, domestic violence, neglect. And so it can have long-lasting effects, especially children. We're focusing here on children, right? And so sometimes, so just like we react to stress differently, we can also react to trauma differently. It's not identical for everybody. Everyone's going to respond differently. So there's important to understand, no right or wrong way to react to it. The key thing to remember, and I say this consistently to my clients, and I'm sure you've heard this from other professionals in the field, that what you are reacting to or responding is in a normal way to an abnormal event. So it's one thing I want you to take out of this part, is that you are responding in a normal way to an abnormal event, right? So what are these symptoms? They could include shock, denial, disbelief. Like when you see a scene in front of you taking place, there's that intense shock, right? And then there's confusion, difficulty concentrating, anger, irritability, mood swings, anxiety, fear, guilt, shame, self-blame. Perhaps you withdraw from others. Perhaps you're feeling sad or hopeless. Perhaps you're feeling disconnected or numb. So these are the mental and cognitive type of responses, right? Then you have physical responses. So insomnia, nightmares, that's a common thing. Fatigue, being startled, jumping right away easily, difficulty concentrating, the racing heartbeats, right? Edginess, agitation, nervousness, aches and pains, muscles and tension, right? And so these symptoms, they can last from a few days to months, possibly even years for some people, but slowly fading away with the processing of the event. So even if you are feeling better, sometimes you can be triggered, right? That's why I gave that trigger warning at the beginning today. Again, that is a normal response. And so if the symptoms, they don't lessen over time or they get worse, it could be that that person is now experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. And that's so important. This is when your nervous system gets stuck psychologically and you're in that state of shock where you're unable to process the emotions or that common sense, right? So again, a normal response to an abnormal event. And we know that this takes time to heal, right? That this is involved, especially when death is involved. And the survivor deals with the stress. There's that guilt, survivor's guilt, right? And grief results from a loss of a loved one. And we need to go through that. We need to go through the grieving process, as I think that was mentioned earlier with the father earlier, right? So it's really important to recognize and be aware of that.
Wow, in the space of just a few minutes, I've learned so much. Subhanallah, and I know you're rushing into it because we don't have hours. Otherwise, inshallah, we hope at Haraka Hussainiya to have you more so we can learn much more. I feel a lot of the viewers do have maybe children and will gain from this. But just like.
But I would say, brother, though, if there are children watching, probably not to watch this part. Just not this part.
Yeah, I meant adults with children.
Inshallah,
should be past their bedtimes now.
Because my daughter watches this program too. Every Thursday we try to tune in. Okay. But with the jokes and the games and stuff like that. But when it's heavy topics like that, probably not a good idea.
Yeah, you're definitely right. Just like you mentioned now, each person will deal with trauma differently and will grieve differently. How best does one deal with trauma? And of course, you've just now going to mention different types of traumas that people can face, and I'm sure you'll have an answer for each one being dealt differently because today we're facing different problems in our lives. Whether it's I'm going to give examples. Obviously, maybe couples being stuck, a husband and wife being stuck at home. And now there more fights or problems are arising. Kids being stuck with their parents trying to do their work, the kids running. Being in lockdown has increased mental health. The other day, I'll give an example. A friend of mine called his doctor to just ask about an appointment. He had some, and then the first thing the doctor said is, I'm going to give you the telephone number for the mental health helpline. He said, no, I'm okay. He said, he was joking. He was saying, it's the doctors now, every time there's a problem, they sort of now go towards this because there's a rise of numbers of people having issues. But how should they seek support?
So let's take a look at how you can best deal with trauma and just how to seek that support. But I did notice a really great question here that somebody mentioned, and I'll try to get back to that in terms of, do you think that women have a strong emotional strength compared to men?
Okay.
We're not doing the battle of the genders here, but I think we each have our own ways of dealing with challenges, right? Men tend to deal with it by, pulling back, processing things differently than women. Women have, and these are generalizations because sometimes you see the opposite with both gender, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. And then you have some women that were known, you like to talk, you like to get the stress out by talking, right? So it's all how you deal with stress that I don't think one has more emotional strength than others. I mean, if you look, and we'll get to it, say to Zainab, she exemplified probably more strength than what men could handle, right? So I think it's very personal and very customized to the situation, and there's a whole bunch of factors. And when we talk about how people deal with mental health and issues, there's a variety of factors that trigger your mental health. problems, right? So there's genetics, there's your environment, there's your personality, there's your education. All of these have an effect on how you deal with challenges and stress. And so as such, that will also impact how you deal with situation. So let's take a look at in terms of many different ways. You ready, guys? So to take down some notes here. I got a list here for you.
Just to let the viewers and the listeners know that, alhamdulillah, this will be saved so they can come back to it, inshallah, and watch.
I'll try to reshare it on my page as well, inshallah.
Yeah. Bismillah, sister.
Bismillah. So first and foremost, when we're dealing with stress, you got to move your body, exercise, right? So we know that exercise helps reduce stress. What it does, it releases the endorphins in our body, which help repair our nervous system when it gets shaken, right? So find something that works for you, whether it's running, the gym, biking, swimming. I know lockdown has been challenging, but that's definitely something we found ways around it, right? Working out at home is something that's become the norm now. Behind here, my little studio, I've got like a gym right there, you know? So we got to figure out ways how to do that. So when you do start exercise, you notice how your body, as you move, okay, mindfully, notice, observe it. Notice how your foot hits the ground, your heart rate, your breathing, instead of distracting yourself while exercising. So focus actually on what's happening within your body. This is a form of mindfulness practice, observing your body without judgment, but watching like how your heart rate is, where your mind is going. Notice your feet. You know, this is mindful practice is something that is actually a prophetic tradition. I'm sure you've all heard of how the Prophet used to teach us how to eat, right? Eating, chewing everything, focusing on the taste, the flavor, and sitting down, eating with your hand. These are all mindful practices, being aware of living in the moment of what you're doing. Same thing with this type of exercise when you're dealing with trauma, is be mindful of it. Number 2, connect. Don't isolate, right? So this doesn't mean that you need to talk about the trauma, because when you're around people, you know, they want to talk to you or ask questions, because talking about the trauma can reinforce the neural pathways in your brain for the memory and the emotions. You see that? So this is why in trauma therapy, we don't necessarily talk about the problem of what happened, especially when the clients are not ready. What we do is we focus on strategies, how to focus and break it down. Because when you talk about it all the time, you're strengthening the memory to the trigger, which then it's as though you're reliving it, right? It's really important to understand that. So the idea of connecting is not to talk about it, but to help you feel less isolated with your traumatic thoughts. Because sometimes you are alone and just rethinking, and I see this a lot with patients that I see, right? So you want to ask for support as needed with your friends, families, counselor, or a trusted spiritual guide. Absolutely. That's number 2. Number 3, participating in social activities. So even if you don't like it, the idea here is fake it till you make it. Or what I learned from a course that I'm taking with Sheikh Jafar, and I love how he says it, faith it till you make it. Faith it, right? So definitely like that. So doing normal activities with others that have nothing to do with your traumatic experience, because what you want to do is go back to baseline functioning. You're normalizing, okay? So another thing to do is reconnecting with old friends. This can also get the normalcy back. Joining a support group for trauma survivors, right? This helps connect others to know how you feel and that you don't need to explain, right? Because hearing others' experience can also help you in your own recovery. It could be a different experience, but hearing that others have gone through it and how they process it can help you in your processing. Volunteering, because helping others can also make you feel good by enabling yourself not to feel so helpless, right? This also reminds you of your own strengths, reclaiming back your narrative, your power. This is something I consistently advise to those who are dealing with depression, anxiety, because what it does, it helps alleviate some of their depressive symptoms, subhanAllah. Because when you give of your time to others, and when you connect to others, and when you are helping others, and they feel good, it's almost like a reciprocal effect when you feel them smile after you've helped them.
Definitely.
Whether it's in the hospital, whether it's children, whether it's the elderly, just seeing that, smiling, emotions like that are addictive, right? It also helps, and it gives, like we said, a sense of meaning, a sense of power. And I've heard this from long-time people who are living with depression. They say, not only do we go to a counselor, not only do we take medication if we need to, eat well, sleep well, exercise, get rid of toxic people, but we volunteer. Heard it from their mouth how effective it is. Also, it can help make new friends, right? And it also gets you out of isolation and make new connections. So this is in terms of getting connected, all right? Number 3, okay? involves self-regulating your nervous system through mindful breathing practices. Sounds simple enough, right? But what happens when you engage in mindful breathing practices, and I've done this in a lot of sessions that I've done with different communities, is that, and we do it together as a gathering, both the men and the women, and we put on some nice spiritual relaxation sound, and we go step by step with muscle tension, relaxation, breathing techniques. What it does, it lowers your heart rate, lowers it down. So if your anxiety is high, it brings it down, especially when you're triggered, okay? There are great videos and apps out there, and I'm actually going to show you a quick app that I'm reviewing. So I'm giving kind of like a shout out here, and I highly recommend it. I've looked through it a little bit and I really enjoyed it. It's called Sabr, the Sabr app. And they've got a page on Instagram. I am reviewing it right now. So this is a wonderful, it's from our Sunni brothers and sisters, but regardless, it's some great resources in there in terms of the reciter, the speaker, whether it's Quran, whether it's basic concepts and how they guide you through that meditative practice. It's lovely. So I highly recommend you check it out. It looks, I'm already signed in, but off this device, it looks like I'm not. But this is what it looks like. Okay. Yeah. Sabr. What a great concept, right? Sabr, patience. Yeah, for meditation. So I highly recommend check it out. I'd love to hear, for those of you who are using this app, your thoughts on it. Okay. So this is something that's wonderful. Also, just to keep in mind, on March 16, from my work at Carleton University, I'm going to be doing a stress management workshop. So Tuesday, the 16th at 1:30 Eastern time. At the end of that session, I'll be doing a mindfulness meditation practice. You're more than welcome to join in on Carleton Wellness Facebook page. So even if you're not a student, just join in. I'll be doing a live one, inshallah. Okay.
What's the page called, sister?
Carleton Wellness on Facebook.
Okay, thank you, sister.
All right. So with this third tip, all right, we want to do work on our sensory input, right? So listening to relaxation music. Please don't ask if music is haram. Go back to your marjat. The idea here is there's definitely music that you can listen to with this intention, right? So relaxation du'as, those are incredible when you do the breathing techniques. That's what we do also. And petting a pet. Now, Loz, my cat, is not here right now. Otherwise, I would have demonstrated what that does. But that having a pet, you've surely heard of pet therapy. That can also, the sensory input there can also help distract you in a healthy way and lowers your heart rate as well. That's the idea. A stress ball, right? Have you heard of those stress balls?
Yeah.
Those are really great, again, because it's releasing the sibha, your sibha. Thank you. That was going to be my next one. The sensory input there with the sibha is incredible, especially when you're linking it to Tasbihat al-Zahra, right? We know, As-salamu alayha, there's so much healing in there, right? Absolutely. Another one is smelling scents like lavender or other soothing scents that are powerful. I don't have the book on me right now. Actually, I don't have a hard copy, just a soft copy. And it's called Perfumes of Arabia by Brother Bilal. Forgive me, Bilal, I forgot your last name. But you can easily find it, Perfumes of Arabia. Wonderful book about talking about the different scents and how this author connected it personally, but did research and Islamic history and research behind it. Perfumes of Arabia. In that book, there's a chapter called, chapter on mental health and anxiety and depression. And he gives that chapter of lavender, and he talks about the benefits of that as well. So I highly recommend you check that out. Another technique is grounding techniques, okay? Such as feeling and noticing your feet on the ground, how your back feels on the chair, noticing your breath when you're doing that slow, deep breathing. You notice in this day and age, rush, khabsa, khabsa. We're going from one thing to the next. These are actually part of our own faith, that our own imams and prophets and the Quran and Hadith teach us about slowing down, taking in everything, how we approach our salah, how we approach our food, how we approach reading the Holy Quran, how we approach entering majalis and all of that. It's all about putting yourself in that mind frame. I love especially, yes?
I always say to myself and to others around me that, do we pray salah to sort of get it out of the way, or do we pray salah because we want to? And it's, Ramadan, it's Shahr Ramadan, and we're coming up, we're only 40 days, I think, away from Shahr Ramadan. It's always like, let's pray so we can eat. Let's get it out of the way.
Such a wrong approach.
What is my salah? Is my salah sort of doing it to tick the box, or is it actually doing it because I want to? And subhanallah, you've just mentioned salah.
Absolutely. I do a whole lecture on Islamic traditional rituals for healing from a psycho-spiritual perspective. This was actually my research in my graduate studies. I almost said how many years ago, a long time ago, that only now in the last 10 years that I've actually been applying, because there's been such a need and growth of mental health awareness in our community. So maybe we can do that one time where we can talk about this. It's one of my favorite discussions because I'm so passionate about it, and I've done so much research on it. And when I see it into practice, it's amazing. So moving on a little bit, but these are great observations, brother. And even for our guests who are watching today, to think about that, how you would approach your prayer. Slow, especially the wudu. And we know Imam Sajjad alayhi salam, how he taught, and I'm paraphrasing, but he talks about how he approaches the wudu because of who he's approaching in prayer. Like that is so mindful, being the awareness right there. I can see here the discussion is still going on with that question about men and women emotional strength, guys. I think we've answered it, but it's great that everybody's so engaged. I just hope they're paying attention also to some of these strategies. Khair, inshallah. That's another topic. Men, women, emotional strength. Good discussion.
I think we'll definitely have something for Haraka viewers on that topic, inshallah.
Inshallah.
Ramadan.
Inshallah, Ya Rab. So the key thing when we're talking about that sensory input after that is to acknowledge your emotions when they happen rather than pushing them aside, right? And the idea here is, and I'll give you an example because this is therapy. This is therapy right here. When you are dealing with a difficult situation that is just pounding your head, right? It just keeps coming up again and again. And you do this, right? You're ignoring, you're pushing it back. What happens when you do this? When you push it at something, it intensifies, it comes back and hits you harder. It finds a way to get through, right? So this is something I tell my clients all the time when we're dealing with anxiety and trauma and anything. When an emotion comes and you need to focus on schoolwork, right? Because I work with this university population. When you're working with schoolwork, when you are working on issues like, I don't know, could be housework, you've got an assignment, you've got whatever it is, right? What you want to do is take that emotion, put it, thought or emotion. Take it, almost visualize it. And I do a lot of narrative therapy, which is why I use my hands when we're discussing, maybe because I'm Arab, Iraqi too. But the idea is to take that emotion out, right? Almost like you're seeing it. Take it out, almost like that. Try it with me, brother. So whatever intense emotion, okay, grab it and then take it out almost, right? So you're visualizing it. So then you give it a name. Could be anger, frustration, hurt, feeling helpless, all of these things, whatever it is. Give it a color, give it a metaphor, okay? Take that and put it in a box. Take that box. So do it with me. Put it in a box.
I put it in a box.
Cover the lid.
Close the box.
Take the box.
Take the box. Can I throw it away?
Not yet. Put it on the box. Put it on the shelf. That's another strategy. Yeah, let's further.
I put it on the box.
It's on the shelf now.
It's on the shelf.
Because here's the thing. Throwing it away is like pushing and denying. It'll come back, right? So here you're putting it on the shelf and you're going to talk to it, okay? So I know you can't turn it on, but I'm looking at it and I'm saying, okay, I acknowledge you. I recognize you. I see you. I validate you. You're there. I get you.
You're there.
All right? You're there. But right now, I got to go do this.
No time for you.
So let me, right now, no time, because when you say no time for you, you're not validating it.
I'm not doing well on this. Okay.
No, it's okay. No, you're following along because you don't want to invalidate. So you say, I get you. You're there. Right now, I don't have time for you. Right now. So you're there. I'm going to go do this and I'm going to come back later and talk to you. So we almost have to do this almost like a child when we're dealing with this, explaining it that way, because then you are giving a ahamiya, importance and value, significance to this, because as soon as you invalidate, ignore, deny, push, it comes back and hurts
It comes back harder.
So acknowledging it, validating it, put it here on the shelf. You're going to come back to it later. So here's what happens. Most of the time when I've done this with my clients, we come talk about it. Then I ask them, so how did it feel? What did you do with that? They said, well, when I came back to it, I didn't really feel the need to talk to it anymore. Why? I'm going to test you, brother. Why?
Because it doesn't matter anymore?
Because you validated it. So maybe in that moment, it didn't matter. Absolutely right. In that moment, it didn't matter because you were able to do something else. The intensity of it is lowered. When you come back to it later, you've acknowledged it. Khalas, right? Now, the throwing away of the box, okay? So here, once you can do that, but the thing is, when you're dealing with something that could be reoccurring and you're still dealing with the processing, we need to validate to deal with it. The box thing, Or another thing is watching it like a cloud. Throwing it away, I think it could come back potentially. It's another technique I've used depending on if it's something really intense and deep, you need to process it. But if it's just like a small thing, whatever, throw it away in the box. Another strategy is watching your thought pass by like a cloud. Watching it like a cloud. You see the cloud goes, bye bye, Allah وياك. Allah Muhammad wa Ali. والحسين والحسن وياكم. Bye. Right? So you can watch it like that. That's another strategy. Okay? So there's a lot of strategies like that. I don't want to take a lot of time with, but I think we get the point. Acknowledge, validate, don't deny, don't push. Put it even temporarily in the box to talk with your therapist later. Sometimes you can't deal with it in between your sessions or talking to whoever, right? Key thing here is when you do that, step number 4 is taking care of your overall health, right? Your stress levels, proper sleep, healthy eating habits, avoiding substances to numb or distract your senses, right? Exercise, relaxation techniques, meditation, yoga, du'as, all of that. Needless to say, these strategies, okay, don't work when you're experiencing these high intense emotions of the trigger of the trauma. They won't work in that moment. Try doing that in the middle of an anxiety attack for any of you who've experienced that. It's nearly impossible, right? So this is where you need the therapeutic intervention. Like we said, contact me, I'll refer you. Call the hotlines that we've mentioned earlier, right? Inshallah, that can also help you. Inshallah. It's sometimes it's really important to understand here, brother, that it can be very painful and scary to potentially re-traumatize by opening up. So it's really important to find an experienced therapist in therapy. Like you don't want to go to a dentist to deal with a heart problem just because they're doctors. You need to find a specialist in the field who can deal with trauma, okay? You see how excited I am and passionate about this topic because I'm trained in this and it's one of my favorite types of trauma because it's very delicate and it's very rewarding when you see somebody work through that pain and come out of it and feeling alive again, right? Alhamdulillah, because it helps with the healing and growth, and especially when you use spirituality, right? It's really important.
It's important, I think, to seek the correct and professional support with whatever, and this is something that Ahlul Bayt taught us.
Absolutely. I always those who know.
I always say the example of, they taught us this. I give the example of Imam Ali alayhi salam when he wanted to marry after Fatima al-Zahra. He went to his brother Aqil because Aqil was an expert in, people's genealogy, and he was an expert in people's families and lineages. So he went to him and told him, I want to marry a woman that from her I will gain sons that will be brave and courageous.
Warriors, now, right.
And everyone says, Imam Ali obviously knew, but he wanted to teach us that when whatever it is that you need, you go to the right professional person that will give you the right advice. And I don't know why we do it in everything else, but when it comes to maybe sometimes our mental health, sometimes we don't do it. We don't want to go to the right person. And I always mention that. Seek the correct advice and support.
Absolutely, especially when it comes to your medical and your mental health. We now have a lot of what you see out there, spiritual coaches, life coaches, they've all got their places, but I have to mention, I've written an article about this. You'll find it on the Muslim Vibe, because myself and a lot of mental health professionals and medical professionals were very concerned about the rise of people just giving advice because they've been through something and they want to help people. God bless you for wanting to help people.
That's interesting.
There's nothing better than helping people. However, when you're dealing, like I said, with mental health, people's lives in your hands, you need to be going to the correct people who are regulated. What does that mean? They're part of a regulated body that are monitored and liable for the safety of the public. If there's an issue, they can go and deal with that. Just like medical doctors and lawyers, they're part of the social workers. They're all part of regulated bodies. Life coaches are not, spiritual coaches are not. These are people who have experience in something, which is great. These people could be great for inspiration. Absolutely. But for healing and treatment, no. If they are not regulated by a body, ظهرهم وراهم for liability, I'm sorry. I can't support that. And neither can mental health professionals. Very important. So moving on, just quickly, and when it comes to the area of acknowledging, or rather seeking appropriate help, it's the type of therapy as well. You have the trauma-informed care, which treats the whole person. It recognizes the past trauma and the maladaptive coping mechanisms that individuals may have adopted to survive, right? So that can be, they can have, they've had coping mechanisms to deal with it, but they're very maladaptive. So for example, somebody who was abused by the military, right, could be sexual assault or physical assault. When they see a military personnel, they will have their own way of dealing with it, but it could be very unhealthy, running away from them or seeing something. Like I'm giving an example I've seen before, where somebody was abused by the military and they saw the military walk across where they were, but they were just doing their own thing. This person went in a full panic mode, unfortunately, and they had to, and it was very maladaptive for them because they were constantly denying. So we had to work through the processing of it. Another type of therapy is trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. This is frequently used to address the destructive effects of the trauma it's particularly useful helping youth with PTSD or mood disorders resulting from abuse, violence, or unresolved grief. And cognitive behavioral is very powerful because you're working with maladaptive thoughts, changing processing to create new behaviors. And it's something that I do quite often. So when you go seek the professional, try to find out what their background is and what they are trained in so that they can help you with that. I mean, you're not going to go to a dental hygienist for a root canal. Same idea again. You got to go find the right person. I keep reiterating with different examples.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Alhamdulillah, so much to take from what you've mentioned, and I think the key point is that I've taken on board is that everyone deals with trauma differently. And as you mentioned, there are different types of trauma, and everyone deals differently with them. And if we know someone that's going through trauma, the best thing to do is make sure they're getting the right support from the right people. And encourage them
to talk to someone.
Sometimes people, both me and you are from Iraq, and sometimes mental health is not sometimes, all the time mental health is overlooked, and inshallah more and more people can get involved in actually directing people. You don't have to be, I'm not going to say go and study mental health and become but just making sure that people are directed to the right support
resources.
places. Coming back to to Sayyidah Zainab, and this week we're commemorating her martyrdom, salamullahi alayha. Inshallah, you're granted the ziyarah of Sayyidah Zainab, Sister Berak, very soon. How can we?
So long. Last time 2002. Ya Allah.
Wow. Okay. Inshallah, very soon. How can we take lessons from this great lady, Lady Zainab alayha salam, in the face of trauma, in the face of tragedy? And she is, what you've mentioned, some of the one type of trauma that you mentioned, and you mentioned that this type of trauma is probably that trauma where from a young age all the way up until her martyrdom, she faces that trauma, with losing her grandfather at early age, then seeing, her mother, and, so on up until Karbala. And just Karbala by itself is
it's a whole traumatic experience.
How can we take lessons from this lady, Zainab, salamullahi alayha?
All right, so I'm not going to answer it very simply right away. I'm going to answer psychologically, and then I'll get to it at the end.
Please.
Okay, so please forgive me if I'm going to take a few more minutes.
No,
because
please.
I think there needs to be a background before I can.
Of course.
Have you noticed that I almost avoid answering anything direct to Sayyidah Zainab because there's such, I guess, a concern or fear or worry that I may not do her justice as I want to do her justice. So I always try to answer from what I know before I get to the zubda, as we say at the end. So how I'm going to answer this is understanding suffering. Let's understanding suffering through trauma, because this links in beautifully, right? So suffering, and we look at it from a psychologically research base where it can also have benefits, right? Through the theological and psychological research that's out there. So number one, it has redemptive qualities. What does that mean? Spiritual growth, leadership, resilience, witness, right? So number one. Number two, suffering also signifies important developmental milestones. So there's a famous psychologist, and he's somebody I like to follow because it kind of follows in line with what our Islamic child development talks about. His name is Dr. Erik Erikson, right? And so he talks about the 8 stages of human development where people successfully negotiate specific crises associated with each growth stage, right? And he postulates that if mishandled, these crises can produce suffering, and it can produce produce the necessary motivation for progression to the subsequent stage, right? He was the first psychologist to describe these causes and consequences for a midlife crisis. If you've heard of that before, that was Dr. Erickson. So when this is where middle-aged people often struggle to find their purpose or meaning in life, especially after, let's say, their children have left home. And the only way to move forward with that is to carve out a life of selfless, I always say this word wrong, generativity. I got it. So we have Dr. also Carl Jung, who is a psychoanalyst. He also observed that the foundation of all mental illness is in the avoidance of true suffering, where if we avoid suffering, we avoid growth. Interesting, huh? So number 3 talks about suffering can encourage humility, right? Where we can see this. We see this from different spiritual traditions where it's emphasized that although life can be painful, a higher power is at work, right? Using our circumstances to humble and shape and squeeze us, right? Into what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to be, to learn and grow from. So also when people reach that limit of the resources they have around them, they become willing, let's say for people who are not big on faith, that's when they start to tap into the ultimate resource of Allah, right? And as Muslims, we know we turn to Allah as the first, right? Through the tools of dua and prayers, right? And then we use the resources around us. Just look at people who struggle with mental health, for example. Who do they go to? They go to our frontline workers. I always call them the sheikhs, the alimas, the mullayat. These are our frontline workers in our community. These are the ones that people turn to the first, right? Because they want to get closer to God, healing. Now, at this point, there's also a limit. We know, like we said earlier, if you are not trained in this area, and we know, mashallah, a lot of the scholars and the sheikhs will say, go see a specialist, go. I can only help you so much with the jinn or the sahir or the waswas. I got to send you to get help at this point, right? So number 4, suffering can also stimulate compassion for those who are in pain. Okay, as we're going through all of this, I want you to focus on the theme of what we're talking about here. Lady Zainab, salamullah alayha, as we're going through everything, right? So what happens here is how our compassion is stimulated. It's with the vagus nerve in our body, which is activated to compassion when we think about suffering of others. I really invite you, I'm not going to get into it now, but I invite all of you to go learn about the vagus nerve and the recent research in the last decade that's taken place, how it's all connected to mind, body, heart, and soul. How, we say in the gut, my intuition, it's all interconnected, subhanAllah. We've known this from before, but recent science and research in psychology and science is now proving that, right? Wow. So what we see here is that vagus nerve is activating compassion when we think about suffering. So we know this, every major spiritual or religious tradition, they emphasize on the importance of what? Consolation, relief, and self-sacrificial outreach for that suffering, right? This is a common theme. Number 5, suffering promotes social union and collective action. That's an interesting thought, right? Where different psychologists, we know that there's different views with spirituality and psychology here. I'm going to go back to Dr. Freud, who was the original analytical founder. And there's a lot of things that he say, of course, that go against a lot of what faith says. But he has an interesting thought here that we can explore, where he says, we are never so defenseless against suffering as when we love. Never so forlornly unhappy as when we have lost our love object or its love. Interesting, huh? He clearly viewed that social relations, they cause the suffering, right? However, the spiritual viewer, right? We reflect on the opposite. We say that suffering is actually the cause of our social relation, right? So suffering can bring people together, and it is much better than joy at creating bonds that amongst the group members, right? The 6th and final benefit of suffering instills meaning and purpose. And this, as in our discussion, is something that we can connect with a lot. We see that in many spiritual traditions as well, the role of suffering. It gives a sense of significance and worth to our life. So in Islam, the faithful are asked to accept suffering as Allah's will and to submit it as a test of faith, right? This is common. We accept suffering with the assurance that Allah never asks or puts upon us more than what we can handle. Right? Dr. Viktor Frankl, one of my favorites, he was a psychiatrist and a concentration camp survivor, right? And he was highly known for his ideas that a search for meaning transforms suffering into positive, life-altering experiences. I highly recommend I did my undergrad research on him, and I was going to do it in my graduate studies, but then I focused on Islamic counseling theories and practice. He had a huge impact on me as a young therapist and psychology student, because he was amongst the few that actually put God into the picture, spirituality and meaning, which are something for a young Muslim student to really understand and connect, right? So he writes that in some way, suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds a meaning, such as the meaning of a sacrifice. That is why man is even ready to suffer on the condition to be sure that his suffering has a meaning. Here we see that the search for meaning not only alleviates the suffering, what he postulates is that the absence of meaning can cause suffering. That's such an interesting connection, right? Finally, we look at how positive psychological changes after trauma are also possible. So even when people are so stuck on the negative, we can still have these positive changes, right? When people acknowledge their difficulties, they see themselves as what? Not victims, as what, brother? Survivors. Phantom of a very unfortunate experience. So this can include what? Building resilience, the development of effective coping skills, development of a sense of efficacy, no longer feeling helpless, right? Some people may undergo what we call post-traumatic growth, right? So this is forging stronger relationships, redefining their relationship with new meaning and or spiritual purpose. And this gains a deeper appreciation for life. And sometimes it can sound contradictory, but most of the post-traumatic growth can exist with post-traumatic stress disorder. So from all of these 6 meanings of suffering, or how you can find strength in that, we can see that suffering through trauma can actually empower an individual or a group of people to progress. Because through that sacrifice, we can see that this sets people apart, right? And we can have a powerful influences on people around us as well. Leaders, right? And the most inspirational people in history who have suffered or sacrificed, they have shown us that there are immense benefits that we can be inspired from. We can learn from them and grow through their difficult circumstances. Not only did they refuse to succumb to their suffering, they used it to spur others into action and inspiration. Nelson Mandela, how many years was he imprisoned? And yet look at how he inspired a global movement, right? Of working against apartheid, right? So after discussing all of these points here, you know where I'm heading into, you know where I'm leading, right? One only has to hear the name of Lady Zainab salam Allah alayha, Imam al-Sajjad alayhi salam, for this whole talk to be understood, right? Specifically, what did Lady Zainab's eyes see in Karbala, right? From the thirst of the women and the children, the brutal murders of the men, her sons, her nephews, her protector, Al-Abbas alayhi salam, and finally bidding goodbye and watching, like we were describing earlier with the father, in terms of the beheading of her brother, of Imam al-Hussain alayhi salam. What happened after that? Like we know the burning of the tents, right? The children, the women, they were screaming in terror. They were chased and being captured. What happened after these calamities? What did she do? She had to compose herself. She had to protect all of these terrified women and children. And off to Kufa, they went like common slaves, right? They were chained and humiliated. And then off to Sham after that, where they traveled and they rendered, and this completely, this whole experience of what they went through, like the father said earlier, we can only imagine it and look at it from the modern psychological lens of what they could have gone through, right? But what does she do there? Throughout all of that, like Father Christopher said earlier, she had a role to play, right? What does she do? This didn't render her powerless, right? She rendered the other people, and mostly men, powerless with the speech that she gave, right? She made grown men weep with regret, right? Not once did she succumb. And like the father described, I was reading about that too, because I was really interested in seeing how was Sayyidah Zainab before, right? Growing up, how was she during the different calamities? How was she leading up to Karbala? And it was interesting how he described her the night before and the night after. It was almost like a complete different personality of strength. I kind of, when I look at it from my lens of work, I disagree to a degree, meaning I think she was strong all along and responding like a human being. When you are going to hear that one of your closest family members is gonna happen to them, how are you gonna respond? How I also argue with, or just debate that kind of thing with that thought, is we know, for example, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Imam Ali alayhi salam, Sayyidah Fatima alayhi salam, how did they respond when they were told what was going to happen to Imam Hussain alayhi salam? They responded with grief and weep and pain of what was going to happen. So Sayyidah Zainab alayhi salam, she was this paragon of strength. She was also human at the same time, showing emotion to, again, a normal response to a very extraordinary circumstance, right? So she didn't succumb after, right? She rose with pure resilience. She carried on the message of the mission of her imam at the time, what he sacrificed for. What did she do? To awaken a nation that had betrayed the message, the true message of Islam, while still withholding. This is the key point right there. We know this, we've heard this before. And from a psychological lens, she did all of that while still withholding her own trauma. Her stance with that power and that dignity, with that undeterred faith against the trauma she witnessed, against the hate she faced, right? This epitomizes her strength, her light, and her guidance as a source of inspiration for all of us. Again, through the words, the eternal words of, I see nothing but beauty.
Sister Berak, that was quite inspirational. We've learned so much. I think when it comes to Lady Zainab Salamullahi alayha, just mentioning her name brings grief to our heart.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, we remember, her stance. There would be no Ashura without Lady Zainab Salamullahi alayha. There would be no commemorations of Muharram without her stance after the battle. And that's the reason why Abi Abdullah al-Hussein alayhi salam took the women, especially Sayyidah Zainab alayhi salam, and she stood in the face of the tyrant of her time.
Absolutely.
And subhanallah, even though what we term as trauma, as grief, as tragedy, she still said, as you've mentioned, I see nothing but beauty. On behalf of Haraka al-Hussainiya, I'd like to thank you for your time. It's always an honor and privilege to have you on our live feeds. We know you're very busy. So thank you for your time, Sister Berak. And I pray that inshallah Allah allows you to visit Sayyidah Zainab Salamullahi alayha's shrine very soon, as well as seek her intercession, inshallah. Thank you, Sister.
Inshallah. Barakallahu bikum wa ma'jurin for all the amazing programming that you are all doing. We try to tune in, even though or during our work hours and school hours, but barakallahu bikum. And thank you so much. It's been my honor to even, like I said, each time I have to do anything in the name of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, it gives me nervous jitters because I want to do my absolute best from my line of work to do them justice. And like you said, Sayyidah Zainab alayhi salam, just listening to her name. And just want to add one more thing before I head off.
Yeah,
what you said, brother, is vital here. That she, and I just want to add to that, is that she was the flag bearer of Islam at that time for a short period of time when Imam Zain al-Abidin alayhi salam was ill. She held Islam in her hand at that time. She was representing her Imam at that time until he took back over. She was the voice. And you said, had it not been for her, we wouldn't have Ashura. I would go a step further from the way I look at it. This is my personal view. Had it not been for Sayyidah Zainab today, my sisters, you and I would not have the hijab. We would not have Islam, the true Islam that we follow today.
Well done, sister. Yeah.
Well, we would not have the Islam we would have today had it not been for a woman by the name of Sayyidah Zainab, and the daughter of Sayyidah Fatima, the granddaughter of Sayyidah Khadija, because they instilled all of that in her as the women. And women also forget the empowerment that we have from our own faith. Sure, you say they're role models back in the day, a long time ago. La, quite the opposite. They are our role models of today in our contemporary world. They teach us everything we need to know these days, how to stand up against injustice, our own injustices in our own communities, in our own societies. This is Sayyidah Zainab for us, salam Allah alayha. Never forget that, my sisters. Who you follow, who you come from, and who is your role model. Not the Kardashians today, not the Gloria this or Gloria that, the modern feminism. You have Sayyidah Zainab. She was the ultimate woman who taught us all of that. Never forget that, especially your hijab. On that note, barakallahu bikum wa iyyakum. شكرا جزيلا والسلام
Thank you
الله.
for your time.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
عليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته. Sister Berak.